Next item is a statement by Paul Wheelhouse on Scotland's onshore unconventional oil and gas policy. The Minister will take questions at the end. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their buttons as soon as possible. And I call on the Minister, Paul Wheelhouse.
Officer, firstly, I should say I'm aware that details in relation to this statement were briefly and inadvertently released yesterday, and this is a matter that all Business Bureau members were made aware of at the time. We have discussed this serious matter, Presiding Officer, with those concerned, and I want to reassure you and colleagues across the Parliament that the Scottish Government will take appropriate procedural measures with the intent of making sure that this doesn't happen again. But, Presiding Officers, today's statement on onshore unconventional oil and gas policy is the conclusion of a policy development process that began as far back as 2013. And over this period, our energy and climate change policy has developed significantly. In 2013, our world-leading climate change legislation committed to emission reduction targets of 80% by 2050. Just last week, our Parliament passed new legislation committing Scotland to net zero emissions by 2045. Likewise, no one would have predicted in 2013 that renewable energy sources such as offshore wind would secure a CFD to produce electricity cheaper than existing gas-fired power stations. There has been a dramatic change in public perceptions of the environment, the climate crisis and the expectations of government to respond. Throughout this period, our cautious, evidence-led approach to the future of unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland, including coal bed methane extraction and hydraulic fracturing, the latter commonly known as fracking, has ensured we have reached a policy decision that is fit for purpose. We have considered evidence gathered from a range of independent experts, undertaken the necessary statutory assessments and ensured that people in industry across Scotland have had the opportunity to participate in the policy-making process in a constructive, inclusive and transparent way. We have undertaken one of the most far-reaching investigations into unconventional oil and gas by any government anywhere in the world. This means that I am now able to confirm Scottish Minister's final policy position on unconventional oil and gas, a policy that is informed by facts, evidence and analysis, as well as public views. Following careful consideration of the statutory and other assessments and related consultation responses and all the previous evidence we have assembled, Ministers have concluded that an unconventional oil and gas industry would not be a sufficient positive benefit to Scotland to outweigh its negative impacts. Therefore, based on the evidence on impacts and the clear lack of social acceptability, I can confirm today that the Scottish Government's final policy position is that we do not support the development of unconventional oil and gas, often known as fracking, in Scotland. This means there is no support from the Government for development connected to the onshore exploration, appraisal or production of coal bed methane or shale oil or shale gas using unconventional oil and gas extraction techniques, including hydraulic fracturing and dewatering for coal bed methane. Let me now set out the detail behind that conclusion before setting out how we will enact it. In September 2013, the Scottish Government established an independent expert scientific panel on unconventional oil and gas. The panel's report, published in July 2014, highlighted a number of issues which required further investigation prior to any policy decision being reached. Therefore, on the 28th of January 2015, the Scottish Government put in place a moratorium on unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland. On the 8th of November 2016, we published a set of independent expert reports considering the specific issues identified by the expert panel, covering health, economic as well as seismicity, decommissioning, climate change and transport impacts. This included a health impact assessment undertaken by Health Protection Scotland, which highlighted an insufficiency of epidemiological evidence on health impacts and that a precautionary approach to unconventional oil and gas is warranted on the basis of the available evidence. On the 31st of January 2017, we launched a comprehensive public consultation on unconventional oil and gas, talking fracking, which received more than 60,000 responses. On the 3rd of October 2017, in response to the publication of the consultation responses, I confirmed to this chamber that, having considered the suite of evidence, including expert reports and consultation responses, Scottish Ministers' preferred policy was not to support unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland, subject to the necessary statutory assessments, including a strategic environmental assessment, being carried out prior to decision on the final policy. On the 24th of October 2017, following a parliamentary debate, this chamber voted overwhelmingly in favour of this preferred position. In May 2018, the Scottish Government successfully defended a legal challenge to the Scottish Government's actions relating to unconventional oil and gas. In October 2018, the Scottish Government published and consulted on the SEA environmental report a partial business and regulatory impact assessment, and the preferred policy position itself, updated to reflect the devolution of onshore oil and gas licensing powers in February 2018. The environmental report concluded that the development of an unconventional oil and gas industry in Scotland has the potential for significant negative effects on the environment, even when taking into account of existing regulation and consenting processes. It also concluded that the effect of the preferred policy position would be to avoid the environmental impacts associated with unconventional oil and gas industry. Altogether, 2,577 responses were received to the 2018 consultation, comprised of 329 substantive responses and 2,243 standard campaign responses submitted by supporters of Friends of the Earth Scotland. These responses led to the Scottish Government to form the view that it would be helpful to provide some further clarification on a number of points raised in response to the consultation document, specifically regarding the preferred policy position and its objectives. On the 30th of April of 2019, we published an addendum to the SEA environmental report, the preferred policy position statement and the partial BRIA, and invited further comments on the points covered. The addendum set out that the objectives of the preferred policy of no support were to ensure that in both the planning sphere and in relation to Ministers' onshore oil and gas licensing and regulatory powers, the policy should, firstly, minimise the potential risk of environmental health impacts by adopting a precautionary approach, secondly, promote the achievement of our energy transition goals, and thirdly, maximise the prospects of meeting the Scottish Government's carbon emissions and climate change targets. A total of 98 responses were received on the consultation addendum, comprised of 15 from organisations and 83 from individuals. Presiding Officer, I can confirm that the analysis of the 2018 and 2019 consultations and the responses to those consultations will be published today, along with the final business and regulatory impact assessment, which has been informed by those responses. The majority of responses to both the 2018 and 2019 consultations correspond with those received to our 2017 Talking Fracking consultation, in which the predominant view of respondents who live mainly within the densely populated areas of the Central Belt, where unconventional oil and gas development has been proposed, was not in favour of unconventional oil and gas. No consultation on unconventional oil and gas undertaken by the Scottish Government should be considered to be an opinion poll. However, the overwhelming response to each of these consultations indicates there is no social licence for the development of unconventional oil and gas in Scotland. We have also considered our environment, economic and energy policies as part of this process. The Scottish Government has been at the forefront of global action to limit climate change. Our third climate change plan was published in February 2018, setting out our approach to meeting our statutory emission reduction targets to 2032 and paving the way for Scotland's transition to a low-carbon economy. The plan is due to be updated in 2020. Last week, this Parliament passed Scotland's new climate change bill that contains the most ambitious statutory targets of any country in the world for 2020, 2030 and 2040. In their significant report on global warming, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change stated the world needs to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. Scotland will do so by 2045 at the latest. Presiding Officer, this will require new and existing policies to be developed or reviewed to ensure they are compatible with our targets, and this was evident in the recent programme for government which had climate change at its core. Our environment and economy are intrinsically linked. The transformation of the energy system in Scotland as part of the drive to tackle climate change has the potential to bring significant economic and social opportunities to individuals, businesses and communities. We will work to ensure these opportunities are realised, to ensure a just transition, and similarly securing a stable energy transition that harnesses Scotland's renewable and low-carbon energy potential, creating new jobs and supply chain opportunities, is one of the key aims of Scotland's energy strategy. The Committee on Climate Change advice is clear. Oil and gas will continue to have a role in the energy mix, even once we have reached net zero. However, Scotland faces a similar challenge to all advanced economies in developing cost-effective substitutes for hydrocarbons. That means we require an approach that reduces demand for carbon-intensive fuel sources and lowers our reliance on imported fossil fuels. As outlined in our programme for government, our continued support for oil and gas exploration and production in the North Sea is now based on a sustainable, secure and inclusive energy transition. This includes industry ambitions, as expressed in its Route Map 2035, to become the first net zero carbon basin in the world at the point of production. Presiding Officer, we considered carefully how support for the development of onshore unconventional oil and gas sits with our policies in climate change, the energy transition and the decarbonisation of our economy, and we have concluded that it is incompatible. We will continue to work closely with businesses and key industrial clusters to support action to accelerate cost-effective industrial decarbonisation measures, including the development and deployment of carbon capture, utilisation and storage, as well as hydrogen technologies. Scotland's chemicals industry has conveyed strong views on the potential benefits of unconventional oil and gas for Scottish industry. While we do not share this vision, I want to be clear that our support for Scotland's industrial base and our desire to develop our world-class chemical manufacturing sector is unwavering. We will continue to support the sector in a range of ways in the months and years to come, but we do not agree that unconventional oil and gas extraction is a requirement of the industry's future. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me set out what the policy position of no support for unconventional oil and gas means in practice. On the 9th of February 2018, the Scotland Act 2016 devolved to the Scottish Parliament certain powers to legislate for the granting and regulation of licences for onshore oil and gas. The finalised policy of no support for unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland enables us to set a framework for the exercise of planning and licensing functions in respect of onshore oil and gas licensing devolved under this Act. As a result of our decision, fracking can only happen if licences are issued, and we do not intend to issue any licences which would permit fracking. To put this position into immediate effect, the Chief Planner has today written to planning authorities across Scotland, stating our finalised policy and confirming that a new planning direction is being issued in respect of this policy. That action means that decisions on onshore unconventional oil and gas developments will be made having regard to planning policy and procedure, and within the framework of Scottish Government policy, a policy that does not support unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland. Our finalised policy will also be reflected in the next iteration of the National Planning Framework. Under the Planning Scotland Act 2019, this must be approved by Parliament before it can be adopted by ministers. Once the new National Planning Framework has been approved, no government will be able to adopt a revised national planning framework to support unconventional oil and gas development without the backing of this Parliament, something I'm sure will be welcomed across the Chamber and indeed beyond. I'm mindful of the fact there have been calls from stakeholders and from colleagues in this Chamber for a legislative ban on unconventional oil and gas in Scotland. We do not consider that new legislation is necessary at this time to control unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland. A strong policy position enacted through devolved planning powers and licensing is, we believe, robust, evidence-led and sufficient. However, that option remains open if there is evidence over time that further action is required. Reaching a final decision on unconventional oil and gas is the culmination of careful and comprehensive evidence gathering. We have not taken the process or the decision lightly. At each stage, we've created opportunities for discourse and debate, and I thank everyone who has contributed to this process. At the same time, since the moratorium in 2013, no unconventional oil and gas extraction has taken place in Scotland. The contrast with the gung-ho approach taken in England could not be more stark. Presiding Officer, it is right that this government sought expert, independent, scientific advice and that we took the time that was needed to assess the evidence and seek the views of the people of Scotland. We have now reached a position that will provide the clarity being sought by communities and industry alike and will allow ministers to implement a robust policy, that being that the Scottish Government does not support the development of unconventional oil and gas in Scotland. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The Minister will now take questions. The first from Alexander Burnett.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Minister for early sight of his statement and also for the apology of the accidental release yesterday. The Scottish Conservatives have always supported achieving the right mix of energy supply, including more use of renewables. And we understand the need to support new technologies and businesses and recognise the need for oil and gas in the just transition to a low-carbon economy. However, today's fudge of a final position, but not a legal ban, is just more hypocrisy from the SNP. Because the Minister talks of lowering our reliance on imported fossil fuels, when today's actions fails to recognise the tens of thousands of barrels of shale gas imported daily from across the Atlantic. So it would appear that the SNP support fracking, where they do not think it could cost them votes. Now, we stated previously that whilst the response to the Scottish Government consultation was substantive, consultations should not be used as opinion polls, and responses must be considered on factual evidence. And although the SNP's scientific panel highlighted issues, it also showed how these could be mitigated. So is the Minister confident that the evidence from the panel unequivocally demonstrates that onshore gas extraction is impossible to carry out without adequate mitigation?
Minister.
Well, thank Alexander Burnett for his earlier part of his remarks, and appreciate the issue around the apology. In terms of his wider points around the supply of feedstock for Grangemouth, for example, clearly I'm a minister in the Scottish Government. I've said this point on record before in October 2017. This government can only control the environmental conditions that apply in Scotland. A product which is sourced from outside Scotland is neither a matter for us in terms of trade. We don't have the powers over trade, and we don't have the powers over jurisdictions elsewhere, such as in the United States. We do believe that the North Sea oil and gas industry can provide ethane as a feedstock for plants like Grangemouth, and indeed we would encourage the use of product from the North Sea, as I'm sure the member would, being a supporter of the industry, to see that is used first before we look at imports. But what I would say to him is that we're going to work very hard with the chemical science industry to look at how we can help decarbonise the plant, how we can work to find alternatives to hydrocarbons, as I said in my statement, and we are committed to working with INEOS and other companies in the chemical sciences sector to make that happen. So I assure him that we are not ignoring the issue, but we're going to try and help the industry to actually decarbonise, become more efficient, use less fuel in the first place, and hopefully we can address it through that means. But ultimately, it's other administrations would have to police the environmental conditions in their own countries.
Call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Angus MacDonald. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Minister for advance sight of the statement. As Scottish Labour's spokesperson for environment and climate change, I have joined with campaigners across Scotland and worked with NGOs who have supported us in this fight against fracking for years, for our water, air, land and our communities. Onshore fracking is not a transition fuel, but a toxic new industry, as shockingly proven in England and across the globe. No doubt INEOS and the whole industry will finally grasp the message loud and clear. No fracking here. Crucially, though, this is not a legal ban, which is what my member's bill could still deliver. While I welcome the Scottish Government's no-support policy position today and the robust evidence underpinning it, I seek assurance from the Minister on how its safety will be secured from future governments or whims of future ministers. My amendment was passed by this Parliament to ensure that the National Planning Framework review would further reinforce the Scottish Government's position to be taken forward by the Chief Planner and the position that there be no licences issued in future. So can the Minister today confirm categorically that the NPF process will be guaranteed to be completed in this parliamentary term? And finally, does he agree with me that this no fracking in Scotland statement will reinforce the signal sent by everyone and to everyone by our new Climate Change Act, that sustainable unionised jobs through just transition as part of the green jobs revolution is what we must all work for? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, firstly, can I say, Presiding Officer, I want to recognise that Claudia Beamish and other colleagues across the Chamber have taken a great interest in this subject, and I appreciate very much the kind of bipartisan nature in terms of the engagement that I've had with Claudia Beamish throughout the process to keep each other informed of our respective plans. But I do respect the fact that she has been consistent in her opposition to this, and we've reached an evidence-based process which has ended up with the conclusion that I can see that she's happy with. But I certainly want to reassure Claudia Beamish in regards to the point about NPF 4, because I think it is a very important point, just to re-emphasise our policy of no support will be reflected in the draft, the next iteration of the National Planning Framework, NPF 4. That is expected in the Parliamentary Session 2020-21. I cannot guarantee that it would pass, and I hope the member understands that, because it's the Business Bureau that will determine the business of this chamber. But with our support and hopefully the support of Labour, we can make sure that does proceed to the chamber and is heard. Mr Stewart, I'm sure, will be keen to engage with Claudia Beamish on that. And when NPF comes into force, the provisions of the Planning Scotland Act 2019 will mean that ministers cannot adopt the National Planning Framework unless Parliament has approved it, and once adopted it will also form part of the development plan. And in practice, as I said in my statement, once the National Planning Framework has been approved, no government will be able to change the National Planning Framework to support unconventional oil and gas without the backing of this Parliament, the majority in this Parliament. So I hope that will give some reassurance to Claudia Beamish, who I know is passionate about this issue, that we are sincere about our efforts to reflect that in the NP4, to reflect the meaning of her amendment that she made, and to make sure that we follow through on our commitment.
I call Angus MacDonald to be followed by Mark Ruskell. Angus
Thanks, Presiding Officer. The majority of constituents in my Falkirk East constituency will warmly welcome the Scottish Government's announcement preventing extraction of unconventional oil and gas, as do I. With the climate emergency announced earlier this year, there's clearly no place for fracking in Scotland or indeed further afield. And following Falkirk Council's climate emergency declaration last month, which targets limiting carbon emissions to net zero by 2030, whilst making Grangemouth Falkirk District's first carbon neutral town, will the Government continue to engage with INEOS, PetroINEOS and other major players in Grangemouth with a view to encouraging a full transformation to reducing emissions significantly and assisting them to establish meaningful carbon reduction targets?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Certainly, well, I recognise, again, as I did with Claudia Beamish, Angus MacDonald's long-standing interest in this particular subject. And we do continue to engage positively with those businesses on a range, as I mentioned earlier, on a range of issues, and welcome the significant investments that have been announced by them to date. The Scottish Government is working in partnership with energy-intensive industries to build on the considerable existing strengths of industry across Scotland and to highlight that industrial decarbonisation is an economic investment opportunity. And we will continue to coordinate activity across all partners, including Scottish Enterprise and Falkirk Council, to ensure the skills and expertise in the industrial cluster at Grangemouth can help facilitate significant emission reductions and continue to support economic growth in Falkirk and the wider Scottish economy. And I commend the efforts of the Council to try and aim to make Grangemouth the first carbon neutral town. I look forward to helping them celebrate if that is achieved.
Can I call Mark Ruskell to be followed by David Torrance? Mark Ruskell.
Thank you. On behalf of the Scottish Greens, can I warmly welcome the decision that's been made today. It does enact a decision of this Parliament from 2017 at long last to deliver a ban on fracking using both powers over planning and licensing, and I think draws to a conclusion a campaign that we've been running with communities with the Green Party since 2012. But over the intervening years, communities in the Forth Valley have faced huge amounts of uncertainty. I've spoken to residents who've been unable to sell their homes because of the threat of fracking applications. So can the Minister confirm today that the lifting of the moratorium on planning decisions will finally enable INEOS's application for coal bed methane at Erth to be hopefully rejected by the Planning Minister?
Minister.
On the latter point, I cannot comment because clearly it's a planning matter, but I would say that the appeals remain sisted. But now that our final policy position on unconventional oil and gas is finalised, DPA will now write to parties seeking their views on whether any additional or updated evidence will be required before they submit the report to Scottish ministers, and then ministers will make final decisions on these appeals in line with the policy I've set out today. So I hope that is helpful to Mr Ruskell. I certainly want to put on record, I recognise how unsettling this has been for communities. Unfortunately, the nature of the process, the statutory assessments we had to undergo take time. They have to be done properly, research-based and properly evidenced. And I hope he's comfortable with the process we've gone through. But we now have reached the final policy position that replaces the moratorium, and it's now a position that the planning appeals, which had been sisted, can now proceed in the process.
Can I call David Torrance to be followed by Liam MacArthur?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also welcome today's announcement as somebody who represents a constituency, Kirkcaldy, who has massive coal seams, and there's been a lot of interest in it from certain companies, that I really welcome today's decision. Can the Minister elaborate on the findings of environmental impacts of fracking, and would he agree that it's high time the UK Government followed this Government's lead and ensure that no fracking can take place in the UK so it can meet our net zero carbon emissions?
Minister.
Certainly on that latter point, I very much would hope that UK Government will change tack on the policy position they have set out. The planning direction issued today requires planning authorities to notify the receipt of any planning application for any unconventional oil and gas developments to Scottish ministers under planning legislation. Ministers can call in an application at any time for it to be considered, ensuring decisions on onshore unconventional oil and gas developments can be made having regard to planning policy and procedure and the framework of Scottish Government policy. That's not the approach that's been taken in England. Community views have been very important to us in Scotland as part of our decision-making process. That again has not been reflected in England. And when it comes to the evidence we've gathered, we would be happy to share that with UK ministers in that respect. I point out, it's actually something I perhaps should reference to the Chamber just in response to the point that Mr Torrance has been made, that we now know, as a result of work done by University of Nottingham on 20th of August 2019, that the research they have published says that UK's underground shale gas reserves may deliver only a fraction of the gas that was previously thought to be recoverable. And quite contrast to the British Geological Survey data. So in comparison with 1,300 cubic feet of gas, trillion cubic feet of gas that was estimated by BGS, University of Nottingham estimated to be 200 trillion cubic feet, which is a lot of gas, obviously, but clearly not as significant as has been thought. And we would certainly argue UK ministers should reconsider their position.
I call Liam MacArthur, to be followed by Gillian Martin.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for early sight of his statement, and indeed the inadvertent early sight, but like others, I think welcomed the fulsome apology he offered the Chamber. He's absolutely right to acknowledge the uncertainty that communities across central Scotland who are on or near sites earmarked for fracking have been living with over recent years. But it's very welcome the Scottish Government has now confirmed its decision, confirming that fracking should not happen in Scotland. The Minister mentioned the fact that he hasn't ruled out the possibility of bringing forward a bill in due course. It would be helpful if you could set out to the Chamber what the trigger, what the threshold for bringing forward that bill might be.
Minister. I was a keen follower of football. This sounds like definition about thresholds for VAR, presiding officer, but I would say this, that we've certainly been consistent in our view that this has been an exercise in policy development rather than legislation, and we do not consider that new legislation is necessary to control unconventional oil and gas development in Scotland, and the adoption of our strong policy provides the most appropriate and proportionate means to regulate such development, having regard to the objectives of the final policy. However, the option, as Mr MacArthur has asked a point, and it's certainly a point that I know is of interest to Claudia Beamish as well, and Mark Ruskell and others, the option of new legislation remains open if there is evidence that further action is required. So should this be the case, I'd be happy to work with Claudia Beamish, Liam MacArthur and others in considering legislative steps, and that possibly it was just worth pointing out, though, that any legislation would require similar statutory assessments to be completed and therefore a similar timescale to achieve the outcome that we're talking about, but we would more likely be looking at the use of the licensing framework in terms of the legislation that the legislative power that's now been passed us in the 2016 Scotland Act to specify the technology that would be allowed within Scotland, and obviously that could constrain the nature of developments in terms of unconventional oil and gas extraction.
Gillian Martin, to be followed by Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Scottish Government has set the most stringent emissions targets in the world, targets which the Scottish Conservatives seemed to support last week. But after Mr Burnett's comments today, I'm not so sure. However, the Committee for Climate Change, the UK Committee for Climate Change, was explicit in stating that in order for Scotland to meet its emissions ambitions, the rest of the UK has to do its part. What indication has the Minister had that the UK Government is undertaking its own investigations into unconventional oil and gas? And will he commit to sharing the Scottish Government's evidence with the UK Government so that they can take a similarly well-informed decision?
Minister.
Absolutely. I recognise the points that have been made by Gillian Martin. She's quite right to identify the need that we all have now, given the evident climate emergency, to reflect on our actions. Indeed, that's what the Scottish Government will do in terms of developing a climate change plan, looking at all policies that are in place across the Scottish Government, and equally the UK Government has a responsibility under its powers to look at what it's doing. Gillian Martin is also right. Our cautious and evidence-led approach and finalised policy position, it has been criticised in the past by ministerial colleagues of our colleagues across the chamber from UK Government in terms of the stance we've taken on fracking previously. I hope that we've demonstrated we have done this in the proper way, in a considered way. We're using evidence, and it's a robust policy position we've arrived at. We've not chosen to push forward without checking with communities and indeed science with unconventional oil and gas extraction, despite the pressure from outside. And I would certainly recommend to the UK Government as essential reading the extensive evidence base we have now gathered on unconventional oil and gas, and which our decision today to not support fracking is based. And that evidence is all to be published on the Scottish Government website and will be available to anyone who wishes to use it. But I may be tempted to send a web link to my colleague Kwasi Kwarteng in the UK Government just to make the process easier for him.
Thank you. I call Dean Lockhart, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There must be an SNP party conference coming up soon, because here we have yet another statement on fracking. It has taken 6 years for the Scottish Government to come to this position. This follows 9 reports into fracking, 4 consultations and a court case costing the taxpayer £175,000. After all of this, can the Minister clarify whether today's statement amounts to a legal prohibition on fracking, an extended moratorium, or is it just more PR gloss?
Minister.
I could have predicted this one would come up, and indeed we did. This is obviously a process. As I've said in my statement, there's certainly aspects of the process which I appreciate communities and industry will have been frustrated by the length of time to get to where we are, but they are governed by statute and have to be done in the statutory process, and therefore take time. So we've taken the appropriate time over the last 2 years since I gave my statement in October 2017 to do what Parliament asked us to do in the motion that we passed on 24th of October 2017. And that is to undertake a strategic environmental impact assessment and a business regulatory impact assessment on the preferred policy position, and we have now finalised that position. Today's announcement marks the conclusion of that process, which we've taken towards the development of our policy. It has ensured we have reached a policy decision that is fit for purpose, which enables us to set a framework for the exercise of planning functions and our functions in respect of onshore oil and gas licensing, which arrived after the statement I gave in October 2017. And under this policy, we would not be issuing a licensing round for new underground unconventional oil and gas production. But I would emphasise a point in relation to the language that Dean Lockhart mentions. He would be well aware of the court action he referenced himself in his question, that language is extremely important. We are trying to respect the determination of Lord Pentland in the Inner House of the court session and not put at risk the process which we have taken great care to reach today. And I would encourage the member, that's what I'm going to say about language. We have been very particular in what we have put in the statement today. I appreciate it may not be as exciting as some statements can be on occasion. It may be a case of campaigning in poetry and governing in prose, as I've said previously, but we have had to put the language down in a particular way to give clarity to the policy position so all stakeholders, whether they are for or against unconventional oil and gas, know exactly where we stand, and I'm confident we've done that today.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, clearly opening up any new fronts in fossil fuel extraction is bad for the climate, and can the Minister therefore outline what plans that he has to build a low-carbon, decarbonised energy system in Scotland?
Minister.
Absolutely. Stuart McMillan raised a very important point. I'm sure it's a matter that all of us care about in this chamber. We have published in December 2017 Scotland's Energy Strategy, which sets out a target to deliver across not just power generation, but across heat and transport, the energy we need from 50% or more of it from renewable resources by that milestone. And that's extremely important. Now, oil and gas industry, as I've referenced earlier, has a role in that transition. We're trying to work very hard with the Oil and Gas UK, Oil and Gas Authority and operators to ensure that we achieve a net zero solution centre for the industry and to try and ensure that they achieve their roadmap to 2035, which is not insignificant. It's 15 megatons of CO2 they want to save in terms of the production process itself. And we are clearly pushing on with some vigour on our pursuit of renewable energy in Scotland. I'm delighted to say in the last year for which we've got figures, 76.3% of Scotland's electricity demand can now be met by renewables, and we saw 1.2 gigawatts of new capacity installed in 2018 to 2019 alone. So we're seeing continued investment in renewables driven by a strong policy position from the Scottish Government and the support of the industry.
Claire Baker, to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I've been campaigning for a position opposing fracking in Fife and in Scotland since 2012, and today's statement is very welcome. My understanding is that there are 2 issued licences in Scotland at the moment. How does the Government plan to manage these licences? And what does this mean for the relevant planning authorities? And can I just ask for clarity, the new planning directive which is due to be issued, is that imminent? Is that in the next few days?
Minister.
I believe, just on the latter point, that was to be issued as soon as I'd sat down, but we can confirm that. Obviously, we didn't want to preempt the statement, but that will be issued today. So planning authorities will have that. As I mentioned in response to Mark Ruskell, currently the 2 appeals that are assisted, now that the policy position I've outlined today is finalised, the DPA, the Department of Environment and Appeals, will write to parties seeking their views on whether any additional or updated evidence will be required before they submit their report to Scottish Ministers. So effectively, they will take stock of the position today, see if there's anything changed since the appeals were assisted in terms of evidence base from the applicants, and then we'll proceed to Scottish Ministers will then make final decisions on these appeals. So that's the appropriate mechanism to go down that route, and I hope that's helpful. But I'm happy to discuss the matter with Claire Baker if that's helpful, and I do recognise her own strong interest in this area.
Gil Patterson to be followed by Jamie Halcrow-Johnson.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. Minister, recognising that the licensing of fracking was previously a reserved matter when the Liberal Democrats pushed through the fracking licensing, and that the MPA for part of my constituency in Eastern Dunbartonshire received £14,000 from a director of a fracking company, would he agree that Joe Swinson, who professes to be against fracking but actually voted for it, should hand back the frackers' money and tell the frackers to frack off?
Minister.
I probably need to be careful in how I respond to this question, Presiding Officer. I recognise you probably have an interest in that as well. What I would say in terms of Ms Swinson's voting record issue, I very much recognise that she has been inconsistent on this issue, and I think it will be for the voters of East Dunbartonshire to take their view on that in due course, and I mean, no doubt Gil Patterson will highlight that. But we certainly do recognise that, that there are inconsistencies in parties' approaches, but I'm confident that I'm sure Liam McCarthy will have a consistent position on this, being against fracking, as I know he has, but it's for others outside this chamber to answer to their own actions, Presiding Officer.
Jamie Halcrow-Johnson to be followed by Richard Lyle.
Thank you. In 2016, the Scottish Government commissioned an economic impact assessment into unconventional oil and gas extraction, and this strong and detailed piece of work demonstrated that there would be many potential benefits to Scotland if extraction could take place here. Among them, it highlighted a potential £4.6 billion in gross value added to our economy, over 3,000 jobs, often in highly skilled professions, and £3.9 billion in tax receipts. So can I ask the Minister whether he still recognises those figures, and will he accept that his government's decisions will come at a very high price to our cost to our economy, to jobs and to Scottish public spending?
Minister.
I have to admit I disagree with the premise of the question in this respect, and I will deal with why. Certainly in terms of the economic impact study that we had commissioned from KPMG, the central scenario, which is thought to be the most likely one, taking out of planning constraints and the likelihood that not all sites would be passed by planning, £2.2 billion of spend in Scotland would be the figure that we recognise in terms of additional economic benefits of 1.2, so it's 2.2 billion of turnover, 1.2 billion of economic benefits in Scotland up to 2062, so over a very long period of time, approximately 0.1% of GDP on an annual basis, and supporting at peak 1,400 jobs in the economy, and that's including the supply chain and indirect effects. So with cumulative additional UK tax receipts of 1.4 billion over the period up to 2062. So I would just put it to Mr Halcrow-Johnson. I appreciate the position he's coming from is a disagreement with us, but that he may be overstating the economic impact of a potential industry in Scotland. And on his latter point, I mean, I would also emphasise the cost of mitigation of the climate emissions that were identified by the UK Committee on Climate Change, which would be at the very least in that scenario, same scenario, 0.4 megatons additional emissions annually, even with the strongest regulatory environment in place. That would have a cost to mitigate, and therefore you have to set that against the relatively modest economic benefits, the considerable costs that would come to mitigate those kind of emissions. I'm sure he will be familiar with the kind of figures we're talking about in terms of implementing the climate change plan.
Richard Lyle to be followed by Neil Findlay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So there's no doubt and certainly no fudge, as some in the Chamber suggest. Can the Minister confirm that, unlike England, Scotland will resist fracking to the best of our ability?
Minister.
Absolutely. We obviously, within the bounds of planning policy, I can't fetter the actions of further ministers down the line, and I've outlined to Claudia Beamish the need to enshrine in NPF 4 our policy position. Absolutely, Richard Lyle, we can guarantee that we've taken a robust evidence approach, and I can confirm to Richard Lyle that since onshore oil and gas licensing power was devolved to Scottish ministers in February 2018, and as a consequence of the moratorium on unconventional oil and gas development introduced by the government in 2015, no fracking has taken place in Scotland, and the policy, the finalised, robust policy we put in place today, will certainly enshrine our policy now, and that will be used in processing any planning applications that come in.
Neil Findlay to be followed by Colin Beattie.
The experience of the Public Procurement Bill shows that reliance on regulation and statements of policy intent without legislation leaves policies open to having a coach and horses driven through them, and I believe this could potentially happen with this bill. The government has faffed about with this for about 7 years. Why won't we just take clear and decisive action once and for all and simply legislate to ensure that fracking cannot and will not take place in Scotland?
Minister.
Well, I think Neil Findlay, I'm not saying that this is his characteristic, but he's being a bit mean-spirited today in terms of the approach that we have taken. We have taken time because we needed to take time to do gather the evidence, assess the evidence, consult with the public. 60,000 responses to our Talking Fracking consultation. We've had to do the statutory process and the strategic environmental assessment required by the 2005 Act, which was actually put in place by Labour and the Liberal Democrats when they were in power. So we're actually following through with the legal requirements of this government to get to where we are today. And he may be aware, I'm not sure if he is, but he may be aware his colleagues in the Welsh Government have actually relied on the evidence we've gathered to form their own policy in Wales. So we've actually had a benefit for others, and we're keen to share it with England as well. So I think, if I could just put it to Mr Findlay, I recognise there's a concern, there's always a concern about whether policy will stand up to scrutiny in the test of time. We're willing to work with other parties, including Labour, to make sure this policy position is robust. But I believe what we have put in place today, using our devolved planning powers and our licensing powers we now have since February 2018, is robust. But if we need to, we will work with others in this chamber to make sure it's more robust still.
Colin Beattie.
Presiding Officer, does the Minister share my astonishment that the Scottish Government has repeatedly been criticised for taking advice from a wide range of independent experts, for pledging to publish that advice in full, and for promising to give the people of Scotland a chance to make their views heard?
I think Presiding Officer, Mr Beattie's question is very well timed, given what we've just heard from Mr Findlay. As I've outlined a number of times now, we have taken a robust, evidence-led approach to finalising our policy on unconventional oil and gas. We have considered evidence gathered from a range of independent experts, undertaken the necessary statutory assessments, and we have ensured that people in industry across Scotland have had the opportunity to participate in the policy-making process in a constructive, inclusive and transparent way. We are aware of the strongly held feelings on all sides of this debate. That gave us an extra responsibility to do this carefully and in a considered way, and to listen to all voices. And it's only right that we've then considered all those submissions that have been provided. And I'd like to take this opportunity once again just to thank everybody who's contributed to our policy process, not least members in this chamber, but others outside clearly in the communities that are affected, industry partners as well, and to recognise the considered submissions that so many have made to this process.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our statement on Scotland's onshore unconventional oil and gas policy.